Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe to the channel for regular content on ancient architecture, as well as all of the latest news from the world of archaeology. Deep inside the bedrock under the Great Pyramid is the lowest and largest pyramid chamber, known as the Subterranean Chamber, and it's unused, unfinished, and, in truth, it's always been a big unknown. It's full of bizarre features, including a sloping floor that's uneven, an unquarried western side, a large knob of rock on the eastern wall, a square cut in the flat ceiling, and a vestibule-type feature near the entrance, with a huge bedrock fissure running through it. In my last video, I looked at this room's main focal point, a 10-foot deep square-cut pit that was cut into the floor. A pit that was extended to 36 feet deep in the 1830s by John Shea Perring, in the hope he would find the burial chamber described by Greek historian Herodotus. But nothing was found. The pit is a bizarre feature, and there are a number of ideas as to why it was dug. Are we looking at what would have been the entrance to another unfinished lower chamber, like what we see at the Mastaba of Tea in Saqqara? Is it a kind of drain or soak pit, or is it an excavation by ancient or historic tomb robbers? We may never know for sure, but I think it's important to document the pyramid anomalies, and then maybe a good, solid hypothesis will emerge, as we try and understand why the subterranean chamber was being created. And that leads me to another subterranean anomaly, seemingly the most pointless and unusual passage in the Great Pyramid, and it goes by the name of the Blind Passage, and is also known as the Dead-End Corridor. It gets its name for obvious reasons: a small opening in the southeastern corner of the room, opposite the main entrance, but the corridor leads nowhere. In 1818 it was described by Henry Salt as follows, quote, "On the south side of this chamber is excavated another passage, just wide and high enough for a man to creep along upon his hands and knees. It enters 54 feet horizontally into the rock, and there abruptly terminates." End quote. The opening to this passage is very small, being just 29 inches or 74 centimetres square. Just look at it compared to one of the Edgar brothers in their picture that was taken in the early 20th century. On February the 14th, 1837, explorer Howard Weiss also mentions the Blind Passage in his book Operations Carried On at the Pyramids of Giza Volume 1, saying, quote, "The subterraneous chamber and the passage proceeding from it to the south was strictly examined, but without any other result than the conviction that they were unfinished excavations, nor could the purpose for which the passage had been intended be discovered." End quote. We don't get very much information from Salt and Weiss, and Flinders Petrie doesn't add a great deal as well, believing it was merely the first stage of the cutting of a fresh passage, saying, quote, "The southern passage is very rough, apparently merely a first driftway, only just large enough to work in, intended to be afterwards enlarged and smoothed. Its sides wind 6 or 8 inches in and out." End quote. In their 1910 book, Great Pyramid Passages Volume 1, the Edgar brothers tell us it's more than 53 feet in length, and they also relay a curious observation. Quote, "At one time while engaging in measuring this passage, 4 of us were lying near each other at the inner end for about half an hour, each with a candle burning. We were astonished to notice that our breathing was quite easy, and that the candles burned brightly, in spite of the fact the descending passage away to the north forms the sole inlet and outlet for air." End quote. So make of that what you will, but it seems there was decent airflow in the bowels of the pyramid. They also noted at a distance of 36 feet from the entrance into the Blind Passage, it curves slightly to the west, but 6 feet further on, and it curves back to its original southerly direction. There is a small bedrock fissure precisely at this bend, and it may be the reason for the minor east-west deviation. The end of the passage is uneven, but it is well squared, with variations between prominences and depressions being around 4 inches. Pictures and video from inside the blind passage are really hard to come by, but this picture at the end of the passage was published in the 1961 book Pyramidology by Adam Rutherford. Recently, I've come across some footage recorded by Bales, whose video I've linked below, and here we get a better idea at the end of the passage, and it's also in colour. And I also have to thank Luke Caverns, whose channel I've linked below, because he was lucky enough to crawl right to the end of the blind passageway, and he's allowed me to publish his photographs in this video. You can see Luke in some of the pictures, which I'll continue to use throughout the video. Measurements are one thing, but seeing someone cramped up inside the passage really gives you a true sense of scale. And, all those years ago, I wouldn't like to have been the person tasked with quarrying this passage. The video clips and pictures, as well as video footage from the X account The Great Awakening, and also NEXT and Uncharted X, really show the rough nature of the work, how the corners are not crisp, how the walls are not smooth, and also how the tunnel is not even straight. Flinders Petrie noted its crude appearance, and believed it was only the first stage of the work, and sometime after it would have been enlarged and smoothed. But I'm not so sure. I'll explain why later in this video when I present the possible function of the blind passage. So back to the subterranean chamber, and the Edgars note the entrance into the chamber and the entrance into the blind tunnel are in fact directly in line with each other, with the eastern wall of both corridors being continuous with the east wall of the chamber. But here is a very important observation. The roof of the southern blind passage is 3.5 feet lower than the roof of the northern passage. Also, aside from the pit, which is clearly a work in progress, the blind passage was built at the lowest point in the rectangular subterranean chamber. In terms of data and details, there really isn't a great deal more to discuss about the blind passage. But of course we all want to know, why is it there? Why is it so small in terms of height and width? And why does it end so abruptly? These are all very hard questions to answer, mainly because we don't know the true history of the subterranean chamber. For example, some people think it's older than the pyramid above it, some think it was being constructed at the same time, but it was merely unfinished. The brilliant researcher Keith Hamilton has good reason to believe the subterranean chamber was constructed last and not first, and he thinks it could even be a later intrusive addition. Hamilton thinks the descending passage originally had a dead end, similar to what we see at the impressive Hawara Pyramid. He presents more good reasons for his thinking in his layman's guide, The Great Pyramid Part 1, and I've linked it below in the description. The last body of thought regarding the subterranean chamber is that we could be looking at one chamber, but with activity in different eras of history. For example, maybe the chamber itself was 4th dynasty and then abandoned. Maybe the blind passage was added in the first intermediate period, with looters simply looking for another chamber. Maybe the great pit that we see in the floor was actually dug by Arab explorers, checking to see if Herodotus was right, that Khufu was buried in a deep chamber surrounded by water. And these are all possibilities, because we simply can't discount them. There isn't enough evidence to give a robust history of the subterranean chamber. Even amongst the best researchers there is no consensus. And so, for the rest of this video, I'll point out a few more observations we need to consider and give you my own thoughts and opinions. As stated by the Edgar brothers, the roof of the blind passage is 3.5 feet lower than the roof of the entrance passage. And what this actually means is that the roof of the blind passage, well, the entire opening into the corridor, is below the floor level of the northern entrance passage. And this is strange, and must be considered when we think about the history and the possible function of the anomalies in this chamber. For argument's sake, let's make the assumption the blind passage is an original feature, created at the same time as the subterranean chamber and the entrance passage, which many do believe is correct. Well, pyramid chambers don't have sloping floors. Chambers are dug out, and then paving stones are often added for a nice, flat, horizontal finish, and it's likely the paving stones would be set in such a way that they're flush with the floor of the entrance passage, like this. There are 4 good quality cross sections of the subterranean chamber, one by Maragiglio and Rinaldi, one by Perring, one by Piazzi Smythe, and one by the Edgar brothers. And all of them have the entirety of the blind passage below what would have been the paved floor of the subterranean chamber, if of course it was completed. So this means that if the blind passage was original, it was likely planned to never be seen. It would be below the ground level like this, and if true, it makes us view this passage in a completely different light. Of course, what we call the pit would also have been below ground level, and if Petrie is correct, this could be the beginnings of another corridor and chamber, heading off in a northeasterly direction, and is comparable to what we see in the 5th dynasty mastaba of T, located at Saqqara. And if we look closely at this 5th dynasty pit structure, we can see at the bottom where it's been cut into the bedrock. But we can also see how it's been built up with masonry, so the opening into the underground compartments is neater. Therefore, for the subterranean chamber underground burial chamber, I think this work would have been planned as follows. Firstly, quarry the pit in the subterranean chamber bedrock floor, then quarry the associated corridor and chamber. All of the rocks and rubble would then be removed from the pyramid. Then you'd finish the underground chamber, work backwards and finish the corridor, and then you'd work on the pit entrance, adding masonry to bring the opening up to floor level and also give it a nice finish. Then you'd build up the floor of the subterranean chamber, and the final act would be laying the paving stones. So, why the blind passage? What possible use could it have? And why does the bedrock floor of the subterranean chamber slope towards this passage? Well, everything must be by design. And so, right now, all I can think of is drainage. Because Flinders Petrie did note that after a storm, water would get inside the pyramid, cascading down the descending passageway and ending up inside the subterranean chamber. He noted that the bottom few feet of the pit that was dug by Perring did contain water. So, looking again at the layout of the chamber, and the blind passage is directly opposite the entrance, but it is lower down. And aside from the pit, which I'll discuss shortly, we also know that the opening to the blind passage is at the lowest point in the entire subterranean chamber, meaning any water inside the room would head towards the southeastern corner. Ancient Egyptians had plenty of experience with water management and drainage, as seen by the many channel blocks built into the various temples on the Giza Plateau. So maybe the original plan for the subterranean chamber was to have subfloor drainage. Maybe they dug and dug and dug the blind passage because they wanted to connect it to a natural fissure, defect or void in the bedrock, a way for any water to escape. And well, we all know that a fissure was reached around here, the exact point where the passage bends. Because we're not talking about a lot of water, just what comes cascading down the descending passageway if there was a storm. And this would be important work, because if you're digging a pit below the floor to lead to a potential burial chamber, you do need to think about drainage. This room, which would be the lowest in the entire pyramid, always needs to stay dry. Exactly how the drainage system would work, exactly how it was planned, I don't know. It's just an idea. But maybe there was a plan for more structural work around the horizontal entrance passage, for channel blocks to be added under the paved floor of the subterranean chamber to keep the room dry and to channel any water into the blind passage, and there it can disappear through the fractured limestone. Also, you may have noted the opening to the blind passage is slightly above ground, but if you're adding a channel block right in front of it, it does make sense. So, contrary to Petrie's claims the blind passage was unfinished, maybe this is actually the only part of the subterranean chamber that was finished. That it was always intended to be a crude, small and obscure drainage channel. It was functional, and was planned to never be seen if the subterranean chamber was completed. This of course is all speculative, but I'm trying to look for a solution to a number of problems. The chamber is clearly in an unfinished state, work stopped for one reason or another, but if anyone is to interpret this space, they need to explain why, compared to more traditional pyramid passages, the blind passage has smaller dimensions. They also need to explain why it was cut opposite the entrance, but also at a level below the entrance, below any intended floor slabs, and it's also at the lowest point in the chamber. I'm slowly piecing things together, and I'm building my own hypothesis for the origins of and also the intended plan for the subterranean chamber. But I know that whatever I come up with can never be presented as fact, because there are just too many unknowns. We don't know if the chamber came before, during or after the pyramid was built. We don't know if the pit and blind passage were made at the same time as the subterranean chamber, or whether they're part of some later attempt at renovation or reworking of a pre-existing space. We don't even know if it really is unfinished. Maybe this rough look was just part of a plan, a way to stop potential tomb robbers. Personally, I don't think it was, but I can't know this for sure. And that's what I love about the Great Pyramid. The fact that information and data is out there for everyone to read and digest, and that we can all come up with our own ideas. Because no matter how educated you are in Egyptology, some things will always remain unknown. Mystery surrounds the Great Pyramid, and it always will. And I don't know about you, but that's one of the things I love about it. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.